Are you a D&D 5e player wanting to try different role-playing games for whatever reason, but have no idea where to start? Are you interested in learning about how other role-playing games work mechanically, but don't know the first thing about systems beyond advantage and disadvantage? Are you afraid that learning a new system that doesn't rely on the old D20 will be intimidating or confusing? Well then, friend, if you are just such a person, then this video is for you. A crash course on the 4 most common types of tabletop role-playing game dice mechanics. With so many D&D 5e players recently turning to other RPGs for all kinds of reasons, and a lot of them having no idea of how other game systems work, or that there even are other game systems, I thought I'd provide a kind of crash course on some of the most common dice and system styles out there. So these are what I feel are the big categories of game systems. If you look at role-playing games like a giant tree, then these mechanics are the various limbs from which all games tend to sprout from. I say tend to because there's always going to be something that breaks the mold. I'll talk a little bit about those kind of games at the end. In this video, I'll be using examples from my own 40+ years of role-playing and remarking on what I feel are some of the pros and cons of each dice system and why I find each type of mechanic interesting. Also note that I won't be covering the differences between, say, a class and level-based game like D&D and a classless skill-based game like RuneQuest, nor will I get into things like hit points versus wound levels, different magic rules in each game system, or whether the game's realistic or not. This video deals exclusively with the core dice mechanics behind most games. So first of all, I am a big proponent of the idea that system, in fact, does matter. A different dice mechanic isn't just a novel way of rolling little plastic pieces to get a result for your player character. Each dice mechanic gives a definitive feel to the game. It can actually add to the atmosphere of whatever the game is trying to portray. One of my favorite games of all time, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition, is based on a particular variant of the percentile dice mechanic. Now that mechanic, with its specific variants in place, gives a very unique feel to the Warhammer Fantasy role-playing game, and I wouldn't dream of using any other system to play in the game setting. Facing a Chaos Warrior in the Grey Mountains surrounding the Reichland and rolling a D20 against his armor class would just feel wrong. Not to mention getting him down to 0 wounds and not being able to roll on Warhammer's gloriously brutal critical hit head chart and hopefully send it flying 6 feet away. But I get ahead of myself. Let's start with the one dice system that people coming from D&D are most familiar with, that old standby, the D20 system, as used in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. So most of you watching this would be familiar with the whole notion of the D20. It's very simple. You just take your D20, you add your modifiers, and you compare it to a target number, which in D&D's terms is called a DC, a difficulty class. I think that's what that means. There's some permutations on this. In some versions, if you roll a natural 20, that's really good, like double damage or something. Or if you roll a natural 1, that's really bad, potential fumble, something like that. Again, various permutations exist in all of these different styles of games. Now, some of the pros of using the D20-based system is that it's fairly easy. The math is pretty simple to do in most cases. It's fun, and it's always fun to roll a multifaceted die like that, and it's iconic. I mean, the D20, I even use it in my own logo, and very few of my games that I do in the channel actually use a D20. So it goes a long way in communicating exactly what it is that you're playing. So the math, as I mentioned, it does tend to be a little easier than a lot of games, depending on the version. I mean, Pathfinder 2nd edition is also a D20-based system, but that has a lot more moving parts mathematically to it, whereas D&D, not so much. I mean, it does exist, obviously, but, you know, D&D also adds in a few things that are pretty welcome, like the idea of advantage and disadvantage. That's a pretty interesting and simplifying element, which I think was appreciated by a lot of gamers when we discovered that when 5th edition came out. Now, different D20 games all have their own versions and, as I said, sort of permutations on how that system works. For example, in Symbaroum here, this is also a D20-based game, except that you are rolling under your skill. So you're rolling low. Low is good in this. And you see that in a lot of D20 based games, but otherwise it's all very similar. You know, you'll find armor class as a target number to hit. You'll find hit points, all this kind of stuff. But the system itself is still based on rolling a D20 and, you know, taking into account your situational modifiers and trying to reach that target number, except in this case, the target number is low. You want to roll underneath as opposed to higher. Or another permutation is the Shadows of the Demon Lord game. This is also a D20 game. This is like a version of 5e in many, many, many respects. It also uses D20, and it even has an advantage-disadvantage system, which is similar to 5e, but slightly different. They use boons and banes, which is basically using a number of D6s to add or subtract to that D20 roll to see if you can hit your target number. Again, this is all fairly standard stuff to people coming from D&D who are used to this sort of D20 system. And if you don't know more about this particular game, you might want to check out my introduction of this and several other games in this video up here. Now, some of the cons of the D20 system is that it is swingy. It is very swingy. You never know what you're going to get. You have as much chance of rolling a 1 as you do a 20. And that is because with only one die and 20 possible outcomes, there is no predictable distribution of results. There's no way to predict what that dice is going to come up as, which is fine to me, honestly, because, you know, that could satisfyingly represent sort of the inherent chaos in a combat situation. Your skill is important, but there's always going to be that craziness in a combat that I think a D20 actually represents quite well. What that means is that luck is always going to play a much bigger factor in your games than skill is. So if you're the kind of person that really likes to wager and, well, literally roll the dice on the situations to see whether your character either succeeds or fails, then the D20 is exciting, right? Because even if you're really skilled, there's a big spread between 1 and 20 that could really change things up. You never know. But if you're someone that prefers having a character's skills brought to the fore, in other words, if you have a character that is very, very highly skilled at something and you expect them to succeed more often than not because of their high skill, the D20 system can let you down in that it can turn out to be quite swingy. Now, the second type of generalized system out there is what I call the dice curve system. What this is any game system in which you roll 2 or more dice and you add the results together along with modifiers and you try and meet a target number. So some typical examples, for example, GURPS. This is Steve Jackson's generic universal role-playing system. This is the 3rd edition. I did a Sage's Library on GURPS that you can check out up here if you want to see more about this particular game. This game is you roll 3d6, 3 6-sided dice, and again, it's a roll under. You want to roll underneath your particular skill. The lower you roll, the better. Or Traveler. Traveler is also a dice curve-based system. This is a 2d6 plus modifiers against a target number. That target number is almost always 8. Now, the thing about dice curve systems as opposed to the D20 based system is that a dice curve system gives you more predictable results. You don't always know what it's going to come up as. It's still a gamble. It's literally a roll of the dice. But it's more likely that a 3d6 roll is going to come up anywhere between like 8 and 12 or thereabouts. So what does this mean? That means that in a game like GURPS, skill counts far more than luck does. If you have a very skilled opponent that you're fighting in GURPS, the dice don't matter as much as the skill does. The dice always matter, they always do matter, but they don't matter as much as they do with the D20. There's not as much inherent luck, it's more based on the skill. So again, it's just a flavor thing. It's do you prefer a game in which you really put a lot of points or experience points or whatever into your character to build their skills and you want that to be really reflected in the gameplay, then maybe a dice curve system is going to be more to your liking. Now, with Traveler, it's 2d6, as I mentioned, plus modifiers against a target number of 8. So same basic idea. You get a more predictable spread of the numbers, so you can get a better sense of how your character is going to do in any given situation. Incidentally, the other thing I like, as a brief aside about a game like Traveler, is that anything you roll over your target number, so as I said, target number is typically 8, but anything you roll over that is counted as essentially degrees of success, and those can be applied immediately to help you succeed better. I love mechanics that do that. I've always loved that. If I strike at you with a sword and I hit you really, really good, I want that to be reflected in the damage that I do to you. That's why I've never liked the concept of you roll to hit and then you roll a totally unrelated damage die that has nothing to do with the quality of your hit. Again, that's just my personal opinion, but that's what Traveler tends to do. So to reiterate, the dice curve system, it produces a bell curve, which is the opposite of the swinginess of the D20. It makes the results far more predictable. It models skill mattering more than luck, and it's far easier to predict the outcome of the roll because of the more equal distribution of the results. Now, an interesting hybrid between the D20 system and the dice curve system is Stars Without Number. This is a great game. I'm going to do a whole separate Sage's Library on this one eventually. This particular system is quite interesting. It's, as I said, it's sort of a hybrid between D20 and Traveler in a way, because in combat, you're rolling a D20 just like you would in Dungeons & Dragons, adding your modifiers, trying to beat the armor class, all that kind of stuff. However, when you roll a skill, especially outside of combat, you're rolling 2d6 plus your skill against a target number. So what that emulates is that combat is still inherently chaotic and dangerous and more unpredictable than anything else, but skill matters when you have the time to sort of dedicate your character's time and resources to the task at hand if they're skilled at it. I think it's a really interesting hybrid and a really satisfying way to blend those two systems together. Another game that I put in this category of the dice curve game is anything powered by the apocalypse. So games like this, Dungeon World, for example, or Apocalypse World, or Monster of the Week. There's a whole bunch of them. In which case you are still essentially doing the dice curve model. You're rolling 2d6 plus your mods, whatever that is, and then your results are going to be based on the particular game you're playing and also the action you're doing. But typically it means 2d6 plus mods, you get 6 or less, bad things happen. 7 to 9, something good happens, but with a cost, and 10 or more, you get everything you want. That's essentially what the entire system is. But it's still a dice curve system because you're rolling 2 dice and not 1. And that makes a big difference mathematically, makes a big difference in terms of whether you can predict the results of your character with effectiveness or not. Now we move on to my personal favorite, which is the D100 systems, or percentile systems. This I find one of the most intuitive systems because all of your skills are represented as a percentage. If I have a 65% chance in my skill, I know exactly what my chance to succeed is. It's right there. I pick up the dice, I roll them, and if I get 65 or less, I have succeeded. Very, very intuitive that way. That is, for a lot of people, a very, very easy thing to wrap your head around. Oh, well, I've got a 30% chance. We know that's 1 in 3, and that gives us a sense of how to gauge the task at hand. I've got a 90% chance. Okay, well, I'm gonna bet the farm on that one because that's a great skill level. But the basic core engine is very simple. You take the percentile dice, which of course are 2d10, and you roll them, and if you get the percentage number or less, you succeed. Now, one of the pros of this system is that it's very, very easy to mod. Like the game Mithras and Call of Cthulhu, for example, these are both based on the same engine. These are both D100 games, but the permutations and the details of each are sufficiently different to really make the game experience quite different, even though they're totally opposite genres, but I'm just talking system-wise here. They're very related. They come from the same limb of the tree, so to speak, but they're different in their details, and yet everything works quite well. For example, there's different ways of criticalling in D100 games, or fumbling, or doing opposed rolls, and all of that stuff can work within the same ultimate framework of the D100, and it's all instantly recognizable to any other D100-based game in most cases. Like in RuneQuest, which that's what Mithras is. Mithras is basically RuneQuest 6th edition. Certainly in 3rd edition RuneQuest, if you rolled, I think it's 5% of your skill or less, then you would get a critical hit. And then RuneQuest 3 had something called a special success, which does not exist in a lot of the other games. I can't remember if it exists in Call of Cthulhu or not. It might exist in this edition. This is the 4th edition. I'm not exactly sure. But a special success would be 20% of your skill. So I remember in RuneQuest 3, if you were using a spear, for example, and if you got 20% of your skill or less, yes, you succeed, but you also got a special success. And in that case, I think it meant you impaled your enemy and did more damage or something like that. Different games handle interpretation of the roll slightly differently as well. For example, Hornmaster, if you roll a number ending in 5 or 0 underneath your skill, that's a critical success. If you roll a number ending in 5 or 0 over your skill, that's a critical failure. Otherwise, it's just a regular failure. In Delta Green, if you roll doubles under your skill, that's a critical. Doubles over is a fumble. Opposed rolls in Delta Green in this particular incarnation of the D100 system are interesting because it is a blackjack system. So if I'm opposing you in a roll, whatever that is, we both make our rolls. If we both succeed at our rolls non-critically, then whoever rolled the highest number under their skill wins. And I really like that. And I believe Mithras has that blackjack system in place for opposed rolls. I think that's really cool. And it changes the nature of opposed rolls as well. Because if I have a 60% chance and you have a 40% chance, and if I roll against you and I roll a 52, you can't beat me because your skill is only 40. So even if you succeed, you can't roll higher than what I've rolled unless you get a critical. And that makes skill very, very important to the character. Whereas games D100 games that don't have the blackjack system, like something like the Warhammer 40K role-playing games, if I shoot and I get a great hit, if you dodge that, if you just make a successful dodge, I think in Dark Heresy this was the case, then you've negated my hit regardless of the quality of my hit. That kind of bothers me. I don't like that permutation of the rule. But the point of all of this is that within the D100 core engine, there are so many different variants and variations and different ways to tweak it that it can be fine-tuned to be whatever kind of game you want, all relying on these two little dice, these two little 10-sided dice here. However, there is a con, and this is a con that I've never quite understood. There are people who exist in the world, I've never met any, but I've read about them, that for one reason or another can't seem to quite grasp how to roll these dice, which is very strange to me. This is extremely simple. These two dice can generate a number between 1 and 100, or 0 and 99 if you really wanted to. There is a game I have that uses 0 to 99, but I don't see any real use for that. So in the vast overwhelming majority of D100 games, it generates a number between 1 and 100. And it's very simple. This die, this is your 10s unit, and this is your 1s unit. So if I roll 2 and a 9, that's 29. If I roll a 1 and a 2, that's 12. Now, a lot of people say, well, how do you get 100? How is it possible? It's very easy. You roll 0, 0. 0, 0 is 100. How do you roll a 1? 0, 1. How do you roll a 5? 0, 5. How do you roll a 52? 52. Hopefully this explanation clears it up. It's really, really straightforward. No need to overcomplicate it. Also, a potential con about the D100 system is that some people don't like roll under systems. Especially if you come from D&D, you're used to roll over, right? You want to roll, add the number, compare that to the target. You want to get over that number. A lot of people are inherently sort of averse to games where you roll under. Again, I don't share that aversion. I've played them all, so it doesn't particularly bother me, but there are people that do. There's no real way around that, unless you do a variant of the D100 system like you would find in MERPs or Rollmaster. Again, I did a Sage's Library on MERPs up here. That is a very interesting variant of the D100 system where you have a skill value of anywhere between typically like 20 and 70 or something like that. You roll D100 and you add your skill value to that number. So you're often looking at numbers in the hundreds or 152 or something like that. You compare that to a chart, and that chart determines what the outcome of the action is. So that is yet another variant of the D100. So it's an extremely flexible engine, and it can be made to do many, many, many things. That's one of the reasons why it's my personal favorite. And we move on to well, I won't say the last type of game system, but certainly the next big one on my list, which is the dice pool system. Now, there are many, many, many variants of a dice pool system. We've got something like Vampire the Masquerade. We've got something like Burning Wheel. We've got something like Forbidden Lands. These are all dice pool systems. So what exactly does that mean? Well, what it means is you assemble a pool of dice based typically on your character's relevant stat and relevant skill. And you now have a pool of dice, and you roll that pool, and you're looking to count successes, okay? So for example, in Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition, if I wanted to climb a wall, then I might look at my dexterity stat, which let's say is 3, and I might look at my athletic skill, which say is 4. Well, 4 and 3 is 7. That means I take 7 10-sided dice, because in that particular game, the dice pool is a D10. And I take 7 10-sided dice and I roll it, and I'm looking for successes. And in this version of the dice pool game, a success means any die that comes up 6 or more. So anything that's 5 or less, you can ignore, but anything 6 or more, that is a success. And you want to get as many successes as possible. And difficulty in those games is based on the amount of success required to do a thing. Burning Wheel, very, very similar, except it uses D6s. Or Forbidden Lands. In fact, all of the Mutineer Zero Engine games, even the ones that just use the 2 dice as opposed to the full dice pool, they all work on a very similar principle. You take your stat and your skill, you put them together, and you roll. And in Forbidden Lands case, they're almost always D6s, and you just need 1 6 out of that whole pool to succeed at something. And if you do, great. And if you get more, then you can apply that, much as you do in Traveler, to sort of further the quality of your success. These are the basics of dice pool games, but there are as many variants to the dice pool systems as there are stars in the sky. So, I'll never be able to cover all of them, obviously. A further variant on the dice pool system and on the Year Zero engine that Free League uses is something like you find in the Blade Runner game or in the Twilight 2000 game. This is still a dice pool, but these are dice pools where you only roll 2 dice. It's still considered a pool, though. You're taking your skill and your stat, but each one is represented by a dice of increasing value. So the better you are at your stat, let's say, the higher the dice value it's going to be. So if you're not so good, it's going to be a D6, but if you're really, really awesome, top of the line, it's going to be D12. And the advantage, of course, is that you're still looking to roll a single success, but on a D6, a success happens on a 6. On a D10, you get a double success if you roll a 10, I think, and on a D12, you get a double success if you roll a 10, 11, 12. So with a dice pool of increasing faces of dice, you get more chances to get more successes. So it's still a dice pool system, just operates slightly differently. You don't have a big giant handful of dice that you have to roll. Typically in these dice pool games, the more dice you roll, the more successes you can generate, and the more effective your task is going to be. It's just another way of adjudicating a situation. But some of the pros of a dice pool game is that it's fun. It's fun to grab big handfuls of dice and chuck them on the table. I should mention that a game like Vampire, for example, is a dice pool game, and so is a game like WEG Star Wars. This was the original version of the Star Wars game from back in 1987. And this is also a dice pool game, except in this game, you don't count successes. It's additive. So you are summing the value of the dice that you roll and comparing that to a target number. That's a little too much math for me. I prefer just the simple counting of successes, but still technically a dice pool game. The dice pool games are extremely versatile. The thing I love the most about the dice pool games, the GM is free to determine what the task at hand is going to require based solely on the context. So, for example, if you're in Vampire, the 5th edition, for example, if you're trying to fire a gun, let's say, then it might be dexterity plus firearms. That's your pool. But if you're trying to impress somebody with your knowledge of firearms, if that context is somehow important, then you might roll like a charisma or whatever it is in Vampire and firearm skill. Or for example, if you're trying to intimidate someone by using your brute strength, by flashing your muscles, that might be strength plus intimidate. But if you're doing it using just your raw willpower and your force of will on the person, then that might be resolve plus intimidate. So it's very, very flexible. You can mix and match and use all manner of combinations in order to best represent contextually what's happening to the character that moment. And most of the dice pool systems I've talked about today have that as a feature, so I quite like that. One of the cons, of course, is that is the same as a pro. There's a lot of dice to roll. If you have a very, very small table and you have nowhere dedicated to roll the dice in, and if it's a really big dice pool game like Shadowrun or something crazy, you're chucking all these dice and they might wind up on the floor somewhere or whatever the case. It can be irritating for a lot of people. A lot of people don't like dice pool games for that, which, that's fair enough. The other con is that it's often difficult to gauge the difficulty of a task. It's hard to gauge how hard it's going to be. With a D100 game, if the GM says make a climb roll and you have a 65% chance of doing it, and he says it's a really hard climb, so minus 20, well now you've got a 45% chance, you still have a good intuitive sense of how hard it's going to be to climb that wall. But in a dice pool game, that's not necessarily as a parent, you have to really start to internalize the success rates of these dice pools before you can make those assessments. Again, that's just practice and experience. But it's something that a lot of people, I've heard that they don't like about dice pool systems. So in the interest of full disclosure, that's one of the cons that I've heard out there about those. Now, obviously, there are far more styles of core dice mechanics out there, but those are kind of the main ones. You've got your D20 base systems, you've got your dice curve systems, you've got your D100 systems, and you've got your dice pools. But there are sort of a couple of honorable mentions I want to talk about, and one of those honorable mentions is the Blades in the Dark game and associated games that go with it, for example, like Scum and Villainy. So these games have an engine that is quite different than anything else. There's another one, Band of Blades. This is another variant of that basic dice system. They still technically fall into a dice pool category, but they have their own mechanics. And honestly, I think they do kind of fit into their own category at this point. Now, I don't have a ton of experience with these games. Again, full disclosure. I finished as a player the Band of Blades campaign. It was pretty wild. I played a short campaign in Scum and Villainy, and I ran Blades of the Dark once, like one session. These games have engines that operate on quite a different set of mechanical assumptions that you find in a lot of other games. Suffice to say, if you're looking for something that's quite different from anything I've talked about today, then I encourage you to go and check out the Blades in the Dark and their many variants. Frankly, I don't have enough familiarity with them to give you like a what I think is an informed, valuable opinion on this, because I don't know it well enough, and I'm always hesitant to talk about stuff that I don't really know quite well. I mean, I make enough mistakes as it is on games that I do know well, so I don't want to give a false impression of what these games are. But I will say that they're quite different. Yeah, they really do fall into their own category. So if you're interested in something quite mechanically different, do check out those games. And also, of course, the honorable mention goes to one of my favorite games of all time, Savage Worlds. This one isn't really a dice pool system, and it's not really a curve system, and it's definitely not a D100 system, and it's definitely not a D20 system. This one really has its own set of mechanics. I'm not going to go too much into Savage Worlds here, but I will say that if you want to see how Savage Worlds works, then by all means, go watch season 1 of my main show, linked right here. 22 episodes where I quite thoroughly explore how Savage Worlds works in a role-playing environment. So I hope that was helpful for you guys who maybe didn't know that these games or these types of games existed, or if you were looking for a different feel, a different experience in terms of the dice mechanics and in terms of what that can translate to in your games. I really feel strongly that the more gamers we have in our community that learn about the world of games out there and the wealth of creativity that exists in the many, many, many different styles of games out there, then the more healthy our entire gaming community and environment will be, because there's just so much goodness. There's so much great stuff out there. I would hate to think that there's players out there who never got a chance to even hear about this stuff. I kind of feel like I want to throw as much light on these maybe little known systems or lesser known systems as possible, considering that D&D, it's the elephant in the room. It hogs all of the spotlight. So any chance I can get to try and teach people about all of these different games, that's something I'm going to do. So I hope it was useful. Other than that, thanks for watching. And if you want to help support the show, you can do so on Patreon or join us on YouTube here and become a channel member, or go over to the website memyselfanddie.com and maybe buy some handmade merchandise that we do right here in the home shop. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Me, Myself, and Die.